In this tutorial video, I'll demonstrate how to use the POMster add-on and create a nice scene with some shinies. To get started, I need to get some assets from Polyhaven. With Polyhaven's free resources, I can get a background image, some textures, and a model to make this thing look really nice. The background image is an HDRI of a forest slope. The HDRI will fill out places in the renders where there is no geometry, and it will be used for the reflections. The trees in the scene will need some bark texture, and although I could have downloaded many textures and used them all, I felt it was easier to just vary some things with a random node. Since I'm rendering all this on an old laptop, I have to go with 2K textures instead of the full 4K. Same with the HDRI, I could have done an 8K texture there, but I don't have that much memory on my GPU. The aerial textures are my favorite part of this site. There's so many different grasses, sands, and other things to choose from, but this is my favorite one. The square cobblestone looks too regular for what I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of this as an old path in a forest, so I'll use the irregular shaped cobblestone with some grass. For the stone brick wall, I go for something that looks like it's old and kind of worn, with a little bit of lichen growing on it, to make it look like it's outside. Next is the model section, and this has been growing recently. Well, all the sections have been growing, but I especially like the grasses and others that have been added. But I'm going to use a treasure chest. The final download before starting Blender is POMster, the add-on that will add Parallax Occlusion Mapping to Blender. For this tutorial, I'll go to the latest releases and download version 0.61. And then I switch to the downloads folder where I've been putting all this stuff. I'll open each file in turn and take only the files that I need, because inside some of those texture files there's also a blend file. I don't need that. To keep the tutorial simple, I'll only take the diffuse, the normal, and the displacement textures. Some of these files also include roughness and other textures that I won't need. In the grassy cobblestone texture set, the mask is for the grass. It's white where there's grass and dark where there's no grass. The last thing to unpack is our treasure chest. It has a blend file that we do need and textures, so I'll copy all that. The textures automatically go into the textures folder, but I'll look inside just to see. I'll switch to the Blender app. I'm using version 3.3. Besides POMster, I'll be using 3 other add-ons in this tutorial: Ant Landscape, Extra Objects, and Node Wrangler. Add-ons can be enabled and installed from the Edit Preferences menu in the Add-ons section. To find each add-on, I only need to search for a word in its title, then click on the checkbox to enable it. Extra Objects has 2 variants. I'll use the mesh kind. These first 3 add-ons were built into Blender, but I need to install the add-on for POMster. I will install from the zip file that I got from GitHub and put in the download folder. And finish by enabling POMster. With all the setup done, now I can start creating the scene in Blender. I'll convert the default light into a sun with energy of 1.5. I'll set the angle to 10. This will determine how soft the shadows from the sun will look. Then rotate it so it lights things up nicely for the default camera setup. The default cube will become a wall, so I need to attach a wall texture to it. With the principled BDSF node selected, I'll press Ctrl-Shift-T to add principled setup, which lets me quickly select the texture files and add all the nodes to make it work. Stone brick wall 01. Easy. I'll just set the effect of the normal to 0.6. This will reduce the shadows a little bit. The first spin of the cube and all the textures are flat. It's a bit too shiny, so I'll reduce the specular and change the roughness a bit. This displacement node isn't needed, so I'll delete it now. The displacement effect will be faked with Parallax Occlusion Mapping. I'm keeping the displacement texture for now, just as a reference. In the shader editor, on the right hand side is a POMster tab, and in there is a panel for OCPOM. The defaults can stay the same, I just need to enter the displacement map so it will automatically add some nodes for me. Then press the Offset Cone Step POM button to create the node setup. The purpose of this setup is to generate UV coordinates. It does not generate a shader, that is done afterward. I forgot to add a VU map before I started adding the node setup, so now I need to go to the 3D view and the tool set on the right hand side, the POMster tab. In the Flip UV panel, I'll press the UV map to VU map. With that done, I can set the tangent V input to the VU map I just created. With all that out of the way, I'll hook up the new POMster setup to the UV input of the textures. Now I see the effect of the Parallax Occlusion map. Looks like depth is being added. My screen renders look a little bit fuzzy, so I'll reduce my CPU load by turning down the number of samples in Eevee. Here's a quick animation to show the difference. First I show before Parallax Occlusion map. And then after Parallax Occlusion map. Another way to see the effect is to bring the cube down so that the top face of the cube is level with the floor. See how the 3D cursor appears to move over the geometry, whereas it should be right on the geometry. It's right on the face of the cube. Here I'll switch to before applying POM and then after. I'll go through a bit more movement in order to show how the POM effect sometimes breaks and looks a bit watery when seen from certain angles. This can be corrected by adding more samples or by adjusting the input values, for example for cone ratio. The old UV map can now be removed. Now I'll select the custom input OCPM node and press tab to edit the node group so we can see what's going on inside. The displacement texture's value has 1 subtracted from it, then multiplied by the height to give the depth value a negative value. 0.05 is the maximum depth, and that came from the node create options. But it can be altered here at any time if needed. I'll resize the output so I can see everything that's written. The default cone ratio angle is a little bit low for this certain texture, so I'll increase it to 0.99. That looks better. I'll set it to 0 so we can see what it looks like with cone step disabled. And then set it to 1 to show that this is an error value. 0.999 and so on is the largest value possible. 1 would be the equivalent of infinity, because this number is multiplied by 90 degrees and then plugged into a tangent function. The depth effect looks good now, so I'll start working on the angle of the UV texture just to demonstrate how it can be adjusted without breaking the depth effect. The bricks on the texture seem to be running from top to bottom, but I want them to be running from left to right, so I need to rotate the texture by 90 degrees. I could do this by simply rotating the cube. But in some cases this isn't possible with geometry, so I'll show how to do it in the shader. Near the bottom left of the POM node setup is a value with UV rotation in degrees. I'll set this value to 90 to get things lined up correctly. Good, but now I want to see more of the texture, so I need to change the UV scaling. 2x2 gives me a bit more to look at, and when I view the cube up close, I see that the POM effect is still working correctly. I'll reset the scale back to 1x1 and then change the size of the cube to make it more like a wall. It's a big wall. 64 meters wide, 2 meters deep, and 10 meters tall. After resizing the geometry, I'll have to scale the UVs to match. With a little bit of back and forth, I finally settled down on a value of 6x32. Which looks square to me and doesn't repeat too often. One final look at the node setup, looks good. I'll check on the wall to see how the top looks. It looks like it's not correct, but we won't be seeing the top of the wall in this video, so I'll just leave it the way it is. And one final inspection to make sure. Looks good. To keep things organized, I'll rename cube to wall and move it into its own collection. I'll hide the wall so I can see the next thing I'm going to create. Another wall, but actually it's the arch in the wall that I want. I use Add Mesh Extras Wall Factory. Wall Factory comes with the Extra Objects add-on. I click on the Options panel to expand it, and I see a lot of options, but I only need to change a few. Width and height variance are both changed to 0 to make the output more predictable. I raise the height values so I get less cuts in the arch geometry. By grabbing the slider, I can scroll down through the other options until I come to the openings options. The indent is set to 0 so that the arch is centered, and the bottom is set to 1 so that it's flush with the floor. To keep it simple, I set the bevel value to 0, but it can cause some interesting effects. I want to inspect the geometry to make sure everything looks good before I click away, because then I won't be able to change the options. I click to make it permanent and then enter edit mode so I can remove the extra wall geometry. I go to face edit mode and then select the first face and hold down shift and select the other faces of the arch. I only need to select one face from each block, and then I can use a command to select the remainder of the faces on those blocks. Press Ctrl L to select linked, Ctrl I to invert selection, press X to delete, and select faces. Only the arch geometry remains. I'll switch over to vertex edit mode and shrink down those big blocks. Click once to select none, and then click and drag to box select. Press G to grab and move, X to move only on the X-axis, and Shift to move slowly. Despacito. And then do the same for the right side. Take a look and see if it looks symmetrical. That looks nice. When I unhide the wall, I see the arch looks like it's about the right size, in the right place. You just need to move the wall around a bit. The arch is kind of hidden inside the wall, so I'll increase the depth by scaling it on the y-axis. I need to make a hole in the wall that's the same size as the arch, so I press Shift D to make a duplicate of the arch. This duplicate will be used to cut out a portion of the wall. First, I need to switch to geometry nodes, and then create a new node group. Press Shift A to get the Add menu, then search for Convex Hull. This changes the arch, so it's the smallest mesh that contains all of the arch. I can get a better look at the result by pressing G and dragging the thing. To make the object more efficient, I'll apply the geometry nodes because I won't need to change the setup later. I want the hole in the wall to be a little bit bigger than the arch, so I have room around it to add a kind of a grout between the arch and the wall, to make the change from wall to arch less obvious. It looks like it's a little bit too tall, so I'll press S and Z and scale it down a little bit shorter. And then to keep things organized, I'll rename the arch object. And then move stuff into a wall collection. With just the wall and the wall cutout showing, I'll select the wall and add a Boolean modifier. For the other object, I select the wall cutout, and because it's a Boolean difference, it will remove the cutout from the wall. Now that the wall has a cutout, I can hide the object that's doing the cutout to make it easy to see the hole. I can also leave the cutout object visible and just change its object properties to make it wireframe. I have the wrong object selected. I need to switch to the wall cutout. In the object's viewport display settings, I change display as to wire. Now I can see the hole made by the cutout and the geometry of the cutout. I'll hide the arch and wall so I can make the grout. Press Shift D to duplicate the wall cutout and rename it to grout. This object will be solid, so I change its display as back to textured. Now the grout needs a hole in it for the opening of the arch. I select Wall Cutout again and press Shift D to duplicate. With the arch visible again, I'll scale down the grout cutout. Rename it to keep it organized. With the extra stuff hidden, it's a little easier to see what's going on. It looks like the cutout is wide enough. I just need to scale it up on the Z axis. Just a little bit more. Okay, good. I want the cutout to be slightly inside the arch. I'll bring back the grout and scale it on the y-axis to make it big enough to completely cut out where it needs to cut out. I select the grout now so that I can add a Boolean modifier to make a hole in it. Select the other object, and there, looks good. How does it look when all the pieces are put together? Looks good, just needs a few adjustments to the scaling on the y-axis. I want the grout to stick out a bit from the wall. And then the arch should stick out a bit from the grout. It all fits together nicely. Now it just needs some textures. I select the arch and apply Shade Smooth, but it looks kind of weird. I need to use Bevel, which will make the edges look a little bit softer, more realistic, and fix up the smoothing. I'll bring the amount down to 0.03 and increase detail by changing segments to 2. That's a lot better. Now I can get to work on the texture, working in the shader editor. This is the arch material. I bring specular down to 0.01 and roughness down to 0.35. To add a node, I press Shift A and search for a noise texture. I'll use this noise texture as the basis for all the rest of the texture from color through to height values. To get the input coordinates, I'll use the position in 3D space. For the look I want, I change the scale to 1.5, the detail to 5, roughness to 0.6, and distortion to 0.2. The general look of the stone is good. Now I just need to give it the right tinting. I can do this by adding a color ramp. I want to increase the contrast in the noise texture, so I bring the left slider to position 0.3 and the right slider to position 0.7. The left side gets hex color 7E7D65. The right side's hex color value is DDCAB3. It needs a bit more detail like bump, but I'll leave this texture alone for now and copy it over to the grout and change the colors a bit. With the grout selected, I change its material to arch and then make a copy of the material and rename it. This is some grout. The grout color hex value on the left side is 998975. The grout color on the right side of the color ramp is AC8F61. Then I can right click on the arch and add smooth shading to it. I had a little bit of editing problem, so it'll look like it switches from rendered to not rendered. I'm going to make some minor adjustments to the color ramp values so that the left side is at 0.15 and the right side is at 0.85 for both the grout and the arch. I want to make the stone a bit brighter, so I'll increase the specular to 0.1 and increase roughness to 0.5. And then repeat this process for the arch material. I want to improve the shading on the grout object, so I'll add a bevel modifier to it. The bevel is added after the Boolean modifier, and then I set the amount to 0.03 and segments up to 2. When I switch to rendered view, I need to increase the contrast, so I'll go to the Scene tab and look under Color Management. I want the look to be very high contrast. To give it a rough look, I need to add a bump node to the shader. So Shift A, search, bump. The noise texture factor can plug directly into the height and then be controlled with the values in the bump node. And I think it looks better with invert. There are two ways to control the effect, strength and distance. They both look a little bit different. I think distance controls it a little bit better for what I want. 0.2 is good. Add the bump node to the arch material as well. I should have done this before I split the materials, but I can still do it now. Invert. And distance 0.2. That's good enough for now. We can add more detail later. Let's see what it looks like together with the wall and see if they match up. The textures kind of match, but now the wall looks too dark. One easy way to brighten the texture is to go to its color input to the principled BDSF and insert a hue saturation value node. Then increase the value so that the brightness is increased. A value of 3 makes the wall brightness match the arch brightness. I'll just take a moment to tidy up the node setup a bit. I'll hide some stuff now so that I can focus on the arch. I want to add shell and fringe to this so that it will have more of a three-dimensional rough look. For the depth, I use a value of 0.03. This is the maximum depth. This is also the same amount that the bevel was set to, 0.03. Let's take a look at the Geometry Nodes modifier in the Modifiers tab. I need to set Fringe Geo Exclude to 1 so that it will not generate fringe geometry. I only want the shells for layers of depth. In rendered view, it looks like nothing has changed after adding shell and fringe. I need to go to the shader editor and change the node setup to make it look right. This is the old setup that I need to incorporate into the new setup. The default shell and fringe node setup is quite big, so I'll create it below the original setup. The materials texture is procedural, the noise texture. It's not a loaded file texture, so I'll remove the height texture before pressing shell fringe blend. The new nodes are already selected, so I press G and I move the mouse to position the new nodes a little bit more below the old ones. The node with the green tab is where I need to copy the old setup. I select all the old nodes except for the material output and right click and copy. Select that green node and press tab to enter the edit mode for the node group. I'll select all the nodes in here except for input and output and delete them. Then right click and paste. The noise texture factor output will be used as the displacement or height output. Originally the UV coordinates were coming from the geometry node, but I need to standardize it and make it come from the UV node so that this can be used on multiple layers correctly. Press tab to exit this node group and I can edit the UV input. I don't need any of the old UV map nodes, but I will keep around one of the attribute nodes so that I can change which attribute it gets. Connect the vector output to the UV input. In the Geometry Nodes modifier in the Modifiers tab, I scroll down a bit to Output Attributes and click on it to expand the list. I need Original Position, so I press Ctrl-C while hovering over the name to copy it. Move your cursor over to the name box in the Attribute node and press Ctrl-V to paste the name POMS Original Pause. And now it's critical that I go back up and delete the old texture setup. As soon as I delete the material output node, it fixes it, but I have to delete all the other nodes as well just to make sure it's clean. The material now should appear completely black when rendered in Eevee. I need to turn on the transparency so it will render correctly. I click on the Material tab and I can already see the settings. I changed the blend mode to alpha hashed and the shadow mode to alpha hashed as well. There. Now the effect is visible, but the effect is subtle and there needs to be an increase in the number of layers or shell. The orange outline kind of gives it away that there's some depth to this now. To increase the height contrast, I'll click on the green node that has our custom texture and press tab to edit the node group. For the height output, I'll add a color ramp, which will let me increase the contrast, so to speak, of the height texture. The left slider I'll set to a value of 0.3 and the right slider I'll give a value of 0.7. That will increase the contrast a lot. I can see that something is happening, but it looks like there's a problem. Not enough geometry. So I need to increase the number of shells. Back to the Modifiers tab. Near the top of the Geometry node Input-Output settings is shell count at a value of 4. I'm going to increase that to a value of 16. Around the edges of the rendered geometry, I can see a bit of pixelation. I can fix that by increasing the number of samples. I right now have it set to 1 because I have a kind of a crappy laptop, but I'll increase it to 16 so I can see what it looks like smooth. It blends in well. I'll go back to a setting of 1 for speed. Taking a good look, I can see that the edges are not as straight as the original geometry. It looks like it has some natural variation to it, even though it's just a procedural noise texture. The next step is adding a landscape. I need to unhide the wall so I can see how the opening is positioned relative to the noise that's generated for the landscape. To generate the landscape, in the 3D view, Add menu, choose Mesh and Landscape. To get a better view of what's going on, I'll switch to wireframe view. In the bottom left of the 3D view, I click on the button to bring up the ant landscape menu. I'll reduce the number of subdivisions down to 32 for X and Y. Increase the mesh X and Y size to 64 by 64 to match the wall size. To compensate for the increased size of the landscape, I'll increase the noise size to 32. The displacement of the landscape is not obvious enough, so I'll increase the height to 2. And to make it show properly, I have to set the max min at 2 as well. No fall off, so it looks more natural at the edges. To make the landscape match the wall, I'll set the offset X at about 0.5. To help blend the landscape into the HDRI background, I'll rotate the landscape a bit on the X-axis. -4 degrees. I also want to pull down the edge of the landscape to make it fall off as well. I'll pull it down by selecting the vertices on just one side. If I grab and try and move them by themselves, it looks kind of silly. So I'll go up to proportional editing and turn it on. Then adjust the fall off until it looks good, and then grab the vertices and move down on Z-axis by -2. I'll reposition my view and then make the camera copy this viewpoint by pressing Ctrl, Alt, and numpad 0. That gives me a good start for the camera. I can always change it later. The ant landscape does not generate with UV coordinates, so I'll press Tab to enter edit mode and F3 to bring up menu of functions. Type in unwrap to create a new UV map on the landscape. I press Tab again to exit edit mode. I'll bring up the shaders area so I can create a new material for this landscape. And call it landscape. I want to mix two materials together on this landscape object so that it looks like there's a path that's running through the wall's opening. To do this, I need to create a new texture and draw the path on it. Name it path map and no alpha needed. I'll see what's going on the landscape by switching to rendered view. And just to make it more obvious where I'm drawing the path, I'll reduce the specular and roughness to reduce the amount of shininess. I can literally draw the path on by going to 3D view, then object mode menu, and texture paint. Left clicking the mouse, I can draw something onto the map, then press Ctrl Z to undo it. I need to trim some of the edges, so I'll change the paint color to black. Then I can paint right through the wall to remove the places where the path will be under the wall. I don't want that. I'll speed up the next bit of recording because it's kind of boring watching me draw edges of the path. To make sure that the stuff that I've drawn onto this image is saved with the blend file, I need to go to the image editor, then select the path map. Image menu, save all images. In the image menu, I could also have chosen save as and output to a file. To edit this image, I change the mode from view to paint, and now I can paint the path on if I chose, but I don't want to do that. So I'll press Ctrl Z to undo and go to Image, Save All Images just to make sure it's saved. I switch to the shader editor so I can finish working on this material. Add a Mix Shader node with Shift-A. I'll connect the path map image texture to the Mix Shader to use the colors in the path map image texture to choose which parts of our material will have landscape textures and which parts will have the path textures. I can change the BDF color to approximately match what the landscape and the path textures should be so that I can see visually if I'm getting things correct and not mixing up the two. After duplicating the principled node, I'll make it look like a path color. In 3D view, I'll switch back to object mode so I don't accidentally draw on the landscape anymore. Now that the basic pieces are in place, I can add textures to the landscape and to the path. In the shader editor, I can select the principled node, press Ctrl-Shift-T to bring up the principled setup file chooser. In here, I'll choose my textures directory and choose the texture, and select the diffuse, displacement, and normal map, press principled texture setup, and it will automatically add all the nodes needed to implement those textures. I'll make my normal map strength a little lower because I find it adds too much shadows at a value of 1. I need to delete the node for displacement because it adds some weird effect to the material, and I'm going to be using some functions in POMster to implement displacements in a different way. Then I can select the principled node for the path and press Ctrl-Shift-T again, go through a quick process of selecting the textures, and then I get the nodes automatically. To make it easier to see what's going on, I'm going to clean up the node setup a little bit. I'll speed up the video to make it quick. I press Ctrl spacebar now so I can see what the effect is in the rendered view. It's a good start, but I think I need to change the scale of those textures. With the aerial grass rock texture, I'm going to give it a scale of 2 in both the X and Y axis. I'm going to try out a few different scales for the path and see what looks best. I like 24 the best. I'll keep that. I'll move and rotate the view around a bit to get a better idea of how this is looking. The next effect that I apply to the landscape is shell and fringe. I'll switch to wireframe so it becomes more apparent because in solid view, the front geometry blocks the back geometry. Pressing N to open the tools menu, I go to POMster tab, shell and fringe, and change the height multiplier to 0.1 and press shell and fringe. Doing this will add a geometry nodes modifier to add some extra layers to this and also some vertical fringe polygons. Switching to rendered view, I can see it doesn't work anymore. I need to change the node setup to integrate the whole thing together. But first, I need to go to the modifiers tab and the new geometry nodes modifier. I scroll down a bit through the inputs and I change the fringe geo exclude to 1. This is a Boolean value, it can only be 0 or 1. It means there will be no vertical pieces. I only plan to implement the horizontal shells this time. I scroll down a bit more in the inputs, click on the plus button beside UV and set it to UV map. so that I can have the correct UV coordinates coming through to the material. Also, to prevent any possible errors, I'm going to set the camera object as well. I want to have a full screen view of the shader editor, so I'll press Ctrl spacebar while my mouse cursor is in the shader editor area. This whole setup as it exists will be encapsulated inside of a group node. In the tools menu on the right side of the editor, I'll look at the POMster tab and the shell and fringe area. There are no textures there, and I want them to be blank because I'm going to be copying a whole setup, not just 3 textures but 6. Pressing the button creates a big setup. I can press G and move the whole setup around now to make sure it doesn't interfere with the old setup. I'll copy the old set of nodes all the way up to but not including the output. I click on the green group node, press tab to edit it, and now I can paste the old setup into this node. After a bit of maneuvering to get it so I can see everything, the output of the mix shader goes to the group output, but I still need to find something to use for the height output. I'll mix the displacements of the 2 different textures together using a map range node. The grassy texture's displacement node is connected with 2min of map range. The cobblestone displacement is connected with 2max. The map range node is similar to the mix shader node for displacement, so now it can be connected to the height output. I want both sets of textures to receive the same UV coordinate, so I'll use the group input's UV coordinates. I'll tidy up the nodes a bit, and then I notice up at the top there's another texture that needs to get the UV inputs from our good. But when I go to rendered view, I can see that it's still not right. I need to do a little bit more fixing on the outside, so I press tab to exit this node. The current setup is not looking too bad, but when I zoom out and look up, I see that the old setup still has a material output that's interfering with the new setup. When rendering Eevee, this should look completely black on one side, at least. I need to go to the material settings and change something. The blend mode and shadow mode should both be set to alpha hashed. I've tried the other options and none of them seem to work except for alpha hashed. The effect is now visible. I'm going to delete the old nodes just so they don't clutter up the space. I'm going to get as close as I can to the landscape without clipping through it to try and show how subtle the effect can be and how to change the options to make it look a little better. Increasing the shell count to 16, I can see a little bit better what's going on. It looks like a whole bunch of layers. Increasing shell count can hide the layered effect. I want to see it with a variety of shell counts now and just show off the differences. From far enough away, it looks like the ground is getting a bit bumpy. That's a nice effect. I select the green group node again and press tab so I can edit it. The displacement effect on the green grass doesn't look like it's strong enough, so I want to adjust it a bit. I'll add a color ramp node so I can easily adjust the, contrast of the displacement. I've done some testing and found that I like the left side to be at 0.15 and the right side to be at 0.85. I'll show what happens when I move the sliders back and forth. The effect will kind of bottom out or max out. I'll repeat the procedure for the displacement of the path as well. This color ramp I'll adjust a little bit differently. I'll leave the sliders in the same position, but change the left side color to be a bit brighter. This will bring up the bottom, so it won't be as low. From the camera viewpoint, I can zoom in a bit on the arch and see how it's integrating with all of this. It looks like some of it is not correct. I need to scale part of the arch to make it pop out and not clip into the grout. I scale it on the y-axis to make it a little deeper. Perfect. I think I'll take another look at it from ground level. The objects look good, but the background is too boring. I'll add that HDRI that I got earlier from Polyhaven. Forest slope. No gump about it. That's much better. In Eevee, the HDRI doesn't add as much detail as it does in Cycles. It basically just acts as a bright source for everything in the scene. I'll adjust its strength down a little bit to bring back some of the variation from the sun lamp. 1/4 strength's enough. The last thing I'll do in this first half of the tutorial is to move the landscape into its own collection. The rest of the tutorial will continue in part 2. Subscribe if you want an alert when that part comes out.